recall talking with Al about Marcus, and he felt at some point that Marcus was getting bigger than the Raiders.
Just win, baby.
If you look up the word feud in the dictionary, it reads as follows: a prolonged and bitter quarrel or dispute. And in this video, we're gonna revisit the Marcus Allen and Al Davis feud. We're gonna talk about the incidents and the occurrences that led to an acrimonious divorce, and how Marcus was able to redeem his career and end up in the pantheon that is the Hall of Fame. In this edition of All Things Considered, I am your host, Bearded Aquarian. Imagine being gainfully employed and you are a top performer and you're taking the company to higher heights. Because after all, when you were hired to do your job and to do it well, and let's say, and imagine you're doing that and you're not compensated based off your performance. Not only that, you start to see the company hire new people and bring them in at a higher pay rate, and they ask you to take a diminished role. I want you to just think about that for a second. Then I want you to ponder, what would you do? And more than likely, most of us, we would probably either quit on the spot, or we would go secretly look for another job and take that interview and go on another job, right? But this is the reality of the NFL back in the older days, is there was no free agency. So if you were a disgruntled player, and sometimes it's unfounded, perhaps that player was ungrateful or just not that great or not good at all. And then you have other players that were good, but no matter how bad their teams were, you were stuck with that team. And I want you to think about Marcus Allen and Al Davis as their feud festered simply from jealousy. And I'm in the proponent to believe in good karma. If y'all remember the Color Purple, the old scene, one of the final scene with Silly, says that everything you do is gonna crumble until you do right by me. I don't know if y'all remember that, but I remember that as a kid, and that's the perfect analogy to describe the fate that Marcus and Al Davis, both of their trajectories. When Marcus signs with the Kansas City Chiefs and Joe Montana in 1993, they beat the Raiders. And even after Montana retired, because he just couldn't do it anymore, Marcus remained with the Chiefs. And every single year, it came down to the Raiders and the Chiefs needing to win a pivotal game. Marcus showed up and shined in enemy territory because the Raiders were now the enemy, and he just took it to the house and he beat the Raiders. And Al Davis and the Raiders of the lost 90s, they just suffered, right? And so I want you to just think about that just for a second, right? And then I want you to also think about when Al Davis brings in Bo Jackson. So you bring in Bo Jackson, right? And so let me give you a history lesson on Marcus. Marcus comes in, he in the league, and the Raiders just sued the NFL. They win, they transition or move or relocate to Los Angeles. Marcus is playing some of his best the ball period, because he's already the greatest, or probably one of the greatest college football players of all time. He's a Heisman Trophy winner, so he already has a championship pedigree. He the Raiders, drafted 10th overall in the '83 season. He has a phenomenal second year as well. And he gets Super Bowl MVP. He rushes for nearly 200 yards. He's 191 respectively. He has the beautiful run where it's called seven Bob Trail. He takes it to the house. And I can still hear John Facenda, that's a narrator of the films, the NFL. He talks about Marcus Allen running with the Knight, and he runs en route to a 38-9 whipping of the Redskins, who are defending Super Bowl champions at that time. So now you have a player that's already polarizing. I gave the job analogy at the beginning, and so now he's doing everything. So then in 1985, the Raiders, they're back on top. They are winning games, and for all intents and purposes, it looks like the Raiders are on a crash course to meet the '85 Bears. Now, I'm not gonna say the Raiders would have lost, but the '85 Bears are probably one of the greatest teams ever assembled, and they just were a fun team to watch. But Marcus Allen was the league MVP, rushing for over 1,700 yards in that season, the 1985 season. And so Marcus because of the wear and tear of the first 4 years of his career. He comes into the 1986 season. The Raiders are not playing like they are capable of playing, but they muster enough bravado, enough resolve to go on this win streak. And so it comes to a pivotal point where they're in this game, late in the game, in the LA Coliseum against the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Raiders can win the game by kicking the field goal. And so they're about to get to a point and they decide, hey, let's run one more play. So Tom Flores, head coach, says, yeah, we'll get the ball to Marcus, because Marcus is usually reliable and dependable. He gets the handoff and Marcus fumbles the ball. Andre Waters, the late great Andre Waters, takes the ball and takes it to the house. The Eagles win the game, and that really shatters the Raider mystique, because really that 85 team, in my opinion, was probably the last of the Raiders of old, where they had that mystique. They were this bully, this mean, this nasty team. And then the 86 team, they were sort of Jekyll Hyde. They were a hybrid. They were this sort of new age Raiders that had a ton of aging veterans, but yet they still had a little bit of a semblance of that bravado that made them the Raiders of old. Because from 1963 to 1985, the Raiders were the most winningest team in all of pro sports. So not just the NFL, and they were the undisputed kings of Monday Night Football. And so now you go into the 86 season, they don't make the playoffs. They don't. You go into the 87 season, and Bo Jackson is drafted in the supplemental draft. So now I told you about, again, we're going to go back to the beginning where he was talking about, hey, you're performing, but they bring another guy in, and the guy doesn't even play 16 games. He plays half a year and makes more money than you. How would you feel if you had a position and they brought another person in that had the same position you got, and they said, oh, well, you're going to bring this guy. We brought this guy in for, let's say, 20,000, 30,000 more than what you make. You would feel some type of way as well. But Marcus, being a consummate professional, he's quiet about it. He says, you know what? I'm going to grab my lunch pail. I'm going to grab my hat, because Marcus had a great upbringing. His father is a real cool dude based off a lot of the interviews that he talks about. And he was taught to be accountable and to do your job. So Marcus, he does his job. He blocks for both. He does all these things, and the Raiders don't really do much with both, because the Raiders don't get to the playoffs. From 87 to 89, the Raiders did not make the playoffs. They just didn't make the playoffs. They were contending, but they never got the wild card, so they never made it. So now you get to the 1990 season. You get all the way to the divisional game against Cincinnati. Unfortunately, Bo Jackson, he actually gets injured on a freak play. And I remember this game because I was a kid, but I remember watching this game. Marcus gets in the game, and Marcus just runs for over, I think, 120 yards. He's just running over Cincinnati. The Raiders go on a crash course, or a clash of the Titans, with the Buffalo Bills, who were upstart, and they were beginning their dominance of the AFC. And the Raiders get killed in the AFC Championship game, 51-3. So now you have a Raider team that's just not getting it done. And you have internal strife and turmoil between Marcus Allen and Al Davis, because simply, let's be honest, you have two commanding presences, two guys that have dominating personalities. You're bound to crash. So now in the 1990 season, again, they come to a game within the Super Bowl. 91, they're a wild card team. They lose. And then something happens. In 1992, Al Davis decides to bring in Eric Dickerson, who's at the tail end of his career. And he was not Eric Dickerson of the Los Angeles Rams, nor really technically of the Indianapolis Colts, because he was dealing with some injuries and whatnot, but was healthy enough to play. And so Marcus signs, Eric signs with the Raiders. And at the time, he didn't know it, but Al Davis, just being petty, brought him in to spite Marcus. And I think it was the same type of scenario with Bo. He brought somebody else in to say, hey, I can get somebody that I think is better than you to show you up. And so Eric plays for the Raiders, and he had a couple long runs, but as I said, Eric was done by that point. He's just playing, right, because the ego in any type of player, you want to continue to keep playing because you think that you still can get it done, but they don't get it done. And so I remember the final game of the year at RFK, Raiders and Redskins. The Raiders rallied and win that game, and they send Marcus off. And so most people don't understand, free agency back in the day sucked, because technically there was no free agency. So you were stuck with a team. So if you were drafted by, let's say, the Bucks or the Lions or some team that just sucked back then, you were stuck with that team. you were stuck. And it was so rare that players were traded. I remember Eric Dixon getting traded from the Rams to the Colts, but you didn't hear about these big names switching, right? But in 1993, a landmark agreement between the NFL owners and the players union, as part of the collective bargaining agreement, they created or they ratified free agency, or amended it, excuse me. And now you have players that they could sign with any other team. And so notably, Reggie White, he signs with the Packers. Marcus Allen signs for the most hated rival of the Raiders, the Chiefs. Carl Peterson, at the time, the general manager for the Chiefs, he signs Marcus. And so let me tell you again, we talked about sealing them in the color purple. Until you do right by me, everything you do gonna crumble, right? And I'm not doing the right hand thing, but you get the gist of it. And so what began to happen is Marcus would play the Raiders twice a year, and Marcus would give the Raiders the business every single time he played. And he played at a high level. It was almost as if just he summoned some ether or some type of energy, and he ran over the Raiders, because Marty Schottenheimer talked about, hey, he coined the term Raider Week. So everybody got pepped up because this is their most hated rival, and Marcus shined. And Al Davis could do nothing but sit up in the suite and just watch and observe and watch his team crash and burn. And the Raiders were literally the Raiders of the lost Raiders of the 90s, because they never got back to prominence. They ever got back to a Super Bowl, never even made a Super Bowl in the 90s. 1990, one game away from a Super Bowl, the Raiders never got any close. In fact, the Raiders made it to the playoffs in the 90s, in 90, 91, and in 93. So out of a decade, they only made it 3 times, and they lost all 3 times. While Marcus Allen and Joe Montana, and even after Joe Montana, Marcus Allen continued to thrive and even won a Comeback Player of the Year award, rightfully so. So in the grand scheme of things, Al Davis had that jealousy about him. He just didn't like certain players. Anybody who got bigger than the Raiders, if you recall, did the same thing with John Gruden. The Raiders lose in the tuck game to Brady and the Patriots, and he had one final year in a contract that I believe Al should have let him fulfill, and more than likely the Raiders at least have 4 trophies instead of 3. You trade him to the Bucks. You think you can bring somebody in to be better at the job, and then remember how karma works. You actually meet your actual architect, the chief architect of that Raiders offense. You meet that guy in the Super Bowl, and you get trashed into oblivion, and the Raiders have not been the same since that Super Bowl. So in the end, I think everybody ended up where they needed to. Marcus moved on to the Chiefs, had a great career, and it galvanized his trajectory to the Hall of Fame, rightfully so. And Al Davis just sat there, and no more Super Bowls. Thankfully for at least the first part of the Gruden years, and really 2002, because that's still Gruden's team, even though he coached them just 2 years into the new millennium. That helped the Raiders become somewhat relevant again. And so with that said, if you enjoyed this video in the format that I presented it in, I'd appreciate a like. I'd also appreciate if you would subscribe as well. This is Beard Aquarium for All Things Considered. And you can take a look at some of my other work on the screen. And remember, it is not goodbye, and see you later. I'm out.
Just win, baby.